listen, just one more thing.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of the TV movie pilot of Columbo, Prescription Murder. First broadcast on the 20th of February 1968 on NBC. It was, of course, written by series creators William Link and Richard Levinson, based on the episode of the Chevy mystery show they wrote called Enough Rope from 1960, which they then turned into a stage play in 1962 before they adapted it back to TV for this movie. The first of two pilots that I am returning to, having reviewed the main series, to see how it compares and contrasts with what was to follow. It was directed by Richard Irving, who was born Irving Israel on the 13th of February 1917 in New York. His family was heavily involved in the theatre, and he began acting on screen in 1943, in small, often uncredited roles in film and some television, before moving into directing for television, where he established himself with dozens of episodes of a variety of early television dramas in the 50s, often live recordings, including Mike Hammer and State Trooper. He was mentor to Steven Spielberg, who would go on to direct the first episode of Columbo, and uncle to Spielberg's first wife, Amy Irving. He died on the 23rd of December 1990. He was 73. The movie begins with a series of Rorschach tests that I'm glad never made it to the series, and a theme tune that I'm a little disappointed didn't. We then fade into a party where psychiatrist Dr. Ray Fleming is taking part in a party game with some of the other guests, including his wife Carol and Bert Gordon, played by William Wyndon, who would go on to appear in the series episode Short Fuse. Mrs. Fleming then has a cake wheeled out, indicating the party is celebrating their 10th anniversary, before Dr. Fleming answers a phone call which seems to be urgent, and he has to excuse himself, something Mrs. Fleming is incredibly annoyed by. Fleming is played by Gene Barry. Barry was born Eugene Class in New York on the 14th of June 1919. He was an accomplished singer and violinist as a child, but later turned to acting, choosing the surname Barry after John Barrymore. He performed on Broadway throughout the 40s before making his television debut in 1950 and his film debut in 1952. He gained fame for his roles on television as the title characters in the Western series Bat Masterson from 1958 to 1961, the murder mystery series Burke's Law from 1963 to 1965, a role he reprised in the series Revival in 1994, possibly inspired by the success of the Columbo revival, and in The Name of the Game from 1968 to 1971. In film he was less successful, but did appear in the original War of the Worlds movie as the lead alongside Anne Robinson, both of whom appeared in Steven Spielberg's 2005 remake. He died on the 9th of December 2009. He was 90. Turns out Mrs. Fleming was right to be annoyed, as the good doctor wasn't going to see a patient, but his mistress. They discuss a plan which isn't immediately obvious, but as this is Columbo, I think it's safe to assume it's murder. Oh, and it turns out Fleming was visiting a patient, as his mistress, Joan Hudson, is a patient of his, so he's not such a good doctor either. Out of the gate, this seems to establish what would be the formula for the majority of the series. We begin with the setup to the murder, a respectable member of society, played by a well-known actor, who also has a secret that would threaten his reputation. His motive for murder appears to be that he wants to be with his mistress rather than solely to protect his reputation. But why not just divorce his wife? Well, in the next scene, after he's returned home to a wife waiting for him, we find out.
Well, naturally, you don't think I'm going to make it easy for you. I'd create as much scandal as I possibly could and ruin your practice entirely.
Aside from taking every penny that I've got.
It's interesting to see these shades of grey in the motive so early on. Yes, he's wrong for having a relationship with a patient, and he's definitely wrong to want to murder his wife, but also, if it wasn't going to leave him penniless and ruin his career, maybe he would have been willing to get a divorce to be with the woman he loves. He's clearly in the wrong, and it isn't justifiable. But is it understandable? I would say yes, up to a point. He has internally rationalised his decision to commit murder as what he sees his only option. And while that's clearly immoral, unethical, illegal and just flat out wrong, it's not entirely irrational. He manages to sweet-talk his wife into believing that he was organising a trip to Acapulco for her, and remarkably, she buys it. The next day, he meets up with Joan, and they continue to plan. It's clear the plan is for Joan to impersonate Mrs. Fleming, to forge some form of displaced time alibi. That's where you commit murder at one time, but make it look as if it was committed at a time when you have a cast iron alibi. We see this in later episodes, such as Suitable for Framing, and usually doesn't work for two reasons. The alibi is so cast iron it looks like it's been manufactured, and this requires an accomplice who usually ends up dead themselves. That evening, Mrs. Fleming is packing for their trip, while Dr. Fleming puts on a pair of what I like to call murder gloves. You regularly see this in murder mystery stories because you have to show the murderer putting on gloves in order to increase the tension, and so the audience doesn't think it's a continuity error if you do it off screen. This, combined with the suspense score, highlights that the murder is about to be committed. He eventually makes his move to strangle Mrs. Fleming, and while it's probably not as long as it would take in reality, it is more realistic than would become the norm as the camera stays on him while he does the deed, almost distracted as the phone starts ringing, adding to the sensory overload of the scene. The sound of the ringing phone is psychologically jarring for audiences and so serves to make us feel more emotionally invested in the scene being over, highlighting the horror of ending someone's life. This is punctuated with her body falling to the floor and hitting the keys of their piano as she does so. It's very Hitchcockian in some ways, with the various cutaways and the scene of her lifeless body on the checkered floor of their apartment, next to a string of pearls she was wearing. Fleming answers the phone, and it's Bert Gordon, who is just making a conversational call. Fleming hangs up and sets the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong, breaking a window from the outside and taking valuables from his wife and the apartment. As he's doing so, he's already made a few mistakes by modern standards that we'll have to see if Columbo picks up on. First, strangling her from behind is a very unusual way for a burglar to kill somebody who interrupts a break-in. Also, breaking the glass in front of the body means glass could get onto the body, meaning she was already dead when the window was broken. Putting clothing into the case he's filling up with valuables so it won't rattle is not a concern a burglar would have, nor is turning off the bathroom light as he does. Finally, actually removing the valuables is more suspicious, as a burglar who murders someone is unlikely to wait around to clean out the place. We'll have to see if any of these things are what tips off Columbo. Joan arrives and is horrified by the dead body, as all women accomplices seem to be in these shows, but still works with Fleming to set up Mrs. Fleming still being alive, as they then board the plane with Joan in disguise, and the supposedly stolen loot coming with them. They have a fake fight on board the plane, making sure the rest of the plane knows about it before Joan leaves the plane, establishing he couldn't possibly have done it. With increased security and technology, this plot would have no chance of working today, but is perfectly believable for the time. While in Acapulco, Dr. Fleming disposes of the swag and then returns home. I hope he remembered to fill his case with something of equal weight for his return, or the disparity will be recorded. He enters his apartment and sees the outline of his wife's body and the broken window, and he then goes to the window as Columbo enters from another room. This is and isn't the Columbo we would come to know and love. He has the trademarks of the raincoat and cigar and just appearing out of a different room at a crime scene, but his suit is neatly pressed and his hair is short and neat. His manner is also immediately more gentle when he explains to Fleming his wife is not actually dead, but she is in a coma. Fleming insists on going to the hospital to see his wife, and Columbo goes with him. While there, he asks Columbo if he has any questions, and again we get some Columbo trademarks, as Columbo says he needs to ask some questions for his report, but doesn't have a pen. Columbo seems much more willing to buy into Fleming's version of events at this stage, something he usually starts out not believing in later series, but still ends the conversation by telling Fleming he had a stewardess identify his wife from a photo and gauging his reaction to the success of Fleming's deception. Bert arrives and speaks with Columbo about solving the case quickly, but Columbo ruminates about why Fleming didn't call to his wife when he first entered the apartment. This would appear to be the first loose thread in Fleming's behaviour for Columbo to pick at. They both go to Mrs. Fleming's room, but a police guard tells them they can't go in because she has regained consciousness and is with the doctor. Barry does a great job of hiding all his emotions about this, but is he too emotionless, as Columbo watches on? The doctor comes out and lets Fleming know that his wife has passed away, which again he remains stoic about, but that her last words were his name, which could easily condemn or clear him depending on how you view that. The next day, Columbo bumps into Fleming in the park, as we see him do so often in later series, and accompanies Fleming to his office, while he rambles before posing a quandary to Fleming about the difference in weight between Fleming's luggage. Fleming claims it was some magazines he took with him but didn't bring back. Not bad. Columbo then asks what his wife was wearing on the night she was killed, but that is not what she was wearing when she was murdered, and the items of clothing are missing from the apartment. As he's there, Joan arrives for her appointment, and Columbo arranges to meet Fleming later. He sees Joan as he leaves and briefly speaks to her. When she sees Fleming, he asks if she left the dress and gloves Columbo was looking for at the apartment.
You left Carol's dress and gloves with the rest of the laundry?
Gloves?
His dress and gloves. Well, you know, Joan, I told you.
Joan forgot the gloves. Fleming tells her to bring the gloves to him, and Joan asks why she can't just throw them away. He insists he wants Columbo to find them. I think this is a big mistake, as it would be infinitely easier to say that she was often losing her gloves than to hide them in a place that Columbo has almost certainly already checked. Another mistake is having Joan come to his apartment to deliver the gloves, then stay for a drink, as the chances are Columbo is watching the apartment for just this eventuality. Fleming does say something interesting here, though. The reason Columbo is investigating is because the murder is too perfect, but believes himself to be so clever he can outsmart the detective. This is the subtext of all later episodes of Columbo, but here is explicitly stated. While with Joan, he hears somebody at the door, so tells Joan to hide, and lets Columbo in. Unable to now allow Columbo to discover the gloves, he tells him he found the gloves, but not the dress, so Columbo insists on having a second look. Just in time, Fleming is saved by the cleaners, turning up with the dress they are looking for. Just as Columbo is about to leave, the phone rings for him. Someone has confessed to killing Fleming's wife, which leaves Fleming baffled. In the next scene, Columbo is interviewing the suspect, and Fleming is in the room. The suspect seems to give a convincing account of how he committed the crime, but Fleming tells Columbo he's lying. Columbo is intrigued by this assessment. He already knows the suspect, Tommy, is lying, and Fleming picks up on this. It appears Columbo's trap has somewhat failed, but Columbo then asks if Fleming did any fishing in Acapulco.
You see, the trouble with places around here is that, well, people keep dumping all kinds of things off the boat. You know, bottles, cans. Oh, it's a terrible shame. Criminal. And, well, I suppose you don't notice that in the ocean.
It's clear now Columbo knows Fleming did it and is exploring his hypothesis as to what exactly happened, and his guesses are spot on. Fleming immediately goes to see Bert, who is a lawyer, and asks for Bert to intervene to prevent Columbo's meddling. If he didn't look guilty before, he sure does now. As Fleming leaves his office in the next scene, Columbo is there. He tells Fleming he has been taken off the case and he can't understand why, although he makes it clear he knows exactly why.
Well, you're a good friend of Mr. Gordon, aren't you? I mean, last week at the hospital he invited you over. You remember that.
Columbo then asks if Fleming will take him on as a patient, as he has a habit of bothering people and he'd like to find out why. Columbo is much more manipulative in this scene, acting almost like a mafia extortionist with his use of language.
When I get taken off a case, right away I figure somebody put the pressure on. Right away I ask myself why. What do you think, Doc?
It's uncharacteristic from what we know the character would become, but Fleming seems to see through this part of the act right away. He goes on to explain exactly how Columbo operates, and appears to have him down pat.
You say you've been thrown off the case, and yet you have the flagrant audacity to come back here and bother me again. I respect that.
Even with all this accurate knowledge of Columbo, Fleming still thinks he's too clever to be caught out, and the scene continues as the two men talk. Columbo asking about the psychology of the murderer. This extended scene does feel more stagey than any other part of the episode so far, and hints at this being an adaptation of a play more than any other scene in the episode. Columbo is essentially asking for Fleming to analyse himself here, and Fleming completely falls for it, despite everything he said a few moments ago. Fleming then goes on to justify the murder in pragmatic terms, and Columbo then implies exactly how he's going to be able to catch Fleming, which Fleming obviously dismisses.
I mean, he's got just one time to learn, just one. And with us, well, with us, it's a business. You see, we do this 100 times a year. I'll tell you, Doc.
With this avenue of investigation closed, Columbo approaches Joan at her job as an actress and does something that would be completely socially unacceptable in modern times. He litters. I mean, I know people will argue that it was a different time and that values, culture was different, but really, detective, discarding waste like that is just wrong. He speaks with Joan and again adopts a gentler tone with her as he questions her. This scene is beautifully framed, with Joan sitting opposite Columbo but reflected in the mirror so we can see both of their faces. It's a shame it doesn't linger on this a little longer before switching to one-shots of them as they speak to each other. After some obfuscation, Columbo comes right out and says that he thinks Fleming killed his wife, before he pulls out the sunglasses Joan wore while disguised as Mrs. Fleming. He then catches her as she tells him he's not on the case anymore, which she has to admit came from Fleming. Columbo then says he has always been on the case, despite efforts to remove him, and Joan insists on calling her lawyer. Columbo then says he will be looking to charge her for accessory to murder, and will be seeing if the staff at the airport can identify her. This stops Joan in her tracks, as Columbo amps the pressure up on her.
I never met his wife.
Would you like to see some pictures of her? I had them taken at the morgue. They're in my briefcase.
No.
Why should you? After all, you saw the real thing. That must have been quite a shock.
This is a tactic we don't see from Columbo later on, and while it feels out of place for the character based on what we come to know of him, in the moment it feels right. He gets angry with her.
I don't want to listen to any of
Now,
this.
you were there when he strangled her, weren't you?
Which we have seen before when doctors are involved in a crime, but he's not usually this forceful with a suspect, perhaps because it comes to nothing as Joan strengthens her resolve and refuses to admit anything. I think we're seeing Columbo learning here. This might have worked, and sometimes probably would, but that's not good enough for the detective, and while it's a very dramatic scene, I think it's much better that we don't see it again. Later that day, Joan leaves the set and Columbo is waiting, having her followed, in a way she's clearly aware of. At her home, she seems to be cracking as she sees the police staking out her place and calls Fleming. He tries to reassure her that Columbo is just guessing, but has no proof, which is true. But is surprised to learn he's still on the case. He arranges to meet her the next day at her appointment and tells her as long as she stays strong, they're in the clear. The next day, Joan fails to make her appointment, so Fleming asks his secretary to call her, and her phone is answered by the coroner.
I want to know what happened.
He explains to Fleming over the phone that there's been an accident, which causes Fleming to go to her apartment, and Columbo is of course there. Fleming goes to see what's happened just in time to see the coroner put her body onto a gurney to be taken away. Columbo tells him she stuffed herself full of barbiturates and while he blames himself for pushing her, he feels he shares the blame with Fleming, because Fleming made her an accessory to murder. He pushes further, saying that Fleming killed his wife for nothing, as he now doesn't have the woman he loved. He tries to get Fleming to confess, but Fleming just laughs it off.
I never loved that girl.
If he did kill his wife, he would have done it for himself.
She helped you with the murder. You'd have had to marry her.
Not really. Something would have been arranged. Like an accident, maybe?
It's at this point Joan emerges, alive and well, having heard Fleming be so dismissive of their relationship. It's at this point we understand how Fleming's arrogance has undone him. Had he kept up any sort of pretense that Joan was just a patient, or that he was in any way sad that she was dead, but had nothing to do with driving her to suicide, he would have likely got away with murdering his wife. But he had to do the classic, if I had murdered my wife, this is how I would have done it bit, and was caught out by the very ruse he used, as it's revealed the body he saw was someone impersonating Joan. This is a brilliant pilot to launch Columbo, even if it took a few more years to go to series, as it shows a young Columbo learning from this first case. It establishes several of the trademarks of the character, but those trademarks don't work against this adversary, so by the time the series comes along, he refines them and perfects them. This, in effect, is Columbo Begins, to return to another character who lays claim to the title of the world's greatest detective. His methods do eventually work, but not by catching the murderer, by convincing his accomplice to turn him in. The gotcha is there to reveal to Joan that Fleming doesn't love her and would have eventually got rid of her too, pragmatically. And that's how he's caught.
He said there was something I should hear.
Something that Columbo would not rely on in future, as there are so many variables that could have gone wrong. I'm a little disappointed none of the mistakes Fleming made during the murder were part of the story, but in an effort to make myself feel better, maybe that's what put Columbo onto him in the first place. I'm also a little disappointed in how quick Joan flipped. I think maybe that could have been a slower process to be more believable, but I'm not sure how you would do that without making it look like Columbo was terrorising her. All in all, this is a fabulous jumping off point for the character, and viewing it after watching the entire series like this might actually be better than watching it first, as it really feels like a good prequel that is less jarring than the shift from this into the regular series. I thought my score might be lower before rewatching, but this really is 5 out of 5. Thank you. Goodbye.